Okay, so that was a quick glimpse of our society's past events. Now, in today's session, we'll endeavor to explore Gandhi's legacy of our time. So, for that, we are really fortunate to have Honorable Dignitary Professor Akeel Bilgramy with us to endorse and embrace this evening's talk. We are also joined by Dr. Masood Ahmed Beg, Principal of Zakir Husain Delhi College, University of Delhi. We can't be enough thankful to them for giving us their valuable time. Now, without taking any more time, I just quickly want to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. Firstly, we'll have a Q&A segment after the lecture for your questions, comments, and observations that will be moderated by my co-host, Biprajit Roy Chaudhary. We look forward to an interactive session with our guests and, of course, the audience. Now, also, we'll highly appreciate if you come live on the screen and interact directly with Akeel sir for your questions and comments. But those who want to use chat box for the same, do mention your name and profession in the beginning. But rest of the time, your microphones should be strictly off to avoid any kind of disturbances during the lecture. Thirdly, any question, comment, or observation must be very brief and strictly relevant to the theme. Lastly, we'll attach a feedback form in the attachments after some time that should be filled by the audience after the webinar, because we highly appreciate your feedback. Now, I request Principal Sir to extend a warm welcome note to our speaker.
Good evening, everyone participating in this distinguished Gandhi lecture series, especially our chief guest, Professor Akeel Bilgramy ji, who is a professor at Columbia University. Good evening, sir, from India, and I hope that must be good morning in USA. So we are all so much delighted to see you here, and it is indeed a matter of great pride that Zakir Husain College has invited you to be the speaker on the occasion of the Gandhi Jayanti on 2nd of October.
Thank
you. Sir, the Gandhi Study Circle, which has become a prime focus in Zakir Husain College and in the Delhi University as such. Today only, I would like to prize my friends and Professor Bilgramy that Delhi University has awarded prize to the principal and the staff member of the Zakir Husain College, both to the Zakir Husain Day College and Zakir Husain Evening College. So this is again a big pride for all Zakirians to be here. Sir, there are nearly 80 colleges in Delhi University. Out of that, only 26 of them were selected for the prize. And Zakir Husain Day and Zakir Husain Evening College both are fortunate enough to have a space in the mind of the Vice Chancellor Delhi University to invite and award the prizes. Certainly, sir, this is a great pride that Zakir Husain College, his students and faculty members are interacting with a great philosopher from Columbia University. Sir, I may have personal interaction with you for a moment. Are you connected to Professor Jafar Raza Bilgramy Sahab and Professor Athar Raza Bilgramy Sahab, or because both of them, Bilgramy is, I think, Bilgramy is a place in Hardoi, perhaps, if I am right.
Yes. I think my family was originally from there, but then they moved to Hyderabad
okay.
sometime in the 19th century.
Sir, are you connected with Professor Bilgramy, both Athar Raza Bilgramy Sahab and Jafar Raza Bilgramy Sahab?
Which Bilgramys?
Jafar Raza Bilgramy Sahab is a professor in political science, Jamia Islamia, and Professor Athar Raza Bilgramy Sahab was a professor at economics department, Jamia Islamia. Both have retired by now.
You know, I'm ashamed to say that I don't know most of my family.
Okay.
In the wider family, I only really know the people mostly in Hyderabad, and so I'm not a good person to talk to about the Bilgramys.
Okay. So, sir, on this occasion, we are eager to hear you, but the only thing is that I would like to focus a few things on Gandhiji's contribution to Indian national freedom. As we all know that he was a pujari of Ahimsa. In fact, in our day-to-day life, we normally try to figure out and mesmerize about his contribution to national freedom on, say, particularly on 2nd of October every year. But I think that Gandhi is a person, we all call him as a vichar, thought, Gandhi thought. So that all live in us, and that should live in, because if we have to see anyone great on this earth, so he has been one of the greatest personality on this earth, as he was the one who endeavored to write and do and write experiment with truth, and the things that he wrote and he first practiced. But what we do in our real life, we write something and practice something differently. So that is why Gandhiji was a Mahatma on this earth. And since I would not like to stay much in between, because Professor Bilgramy is an authority on the subject. So today I am not in a mood to talk about the anything on the Gandhian thought. Dr. Sanjeev and his friends all know me that uh, what are my contents of my speech and my thought about Gandhiji's greatness on this earth. So thank you, Dr. Sanjeev, today. And since in the morning time I have already said so many things about Gandhiji and his contribution, so in this evening I would like to rest with my voice and like to hear the full lecture of Professor Bilgramy. Thank you very much, Aarti Bansal, other co-teams, and all the faculty members of Zakir College, students who have organized this webinar on Gandhiji's legacies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you once again for giving us your valuable time. Now I request Dr. Sanjeev Kumar, convener of our society, Gandhi Study Circle, to give a brief introduction of the theme and introduce our speaker. Over to you,
Thank you,
sir.
Aarti. Thank you, Aarti. Professor Masoor Ahmed Beg, principal of our college, Professor Akeel Bilgramy, eminent scholars, distinguished guests, colleagues, and dear friends. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all at the inaugural session of the Distinguished Lecture Series organized by Gandhi Study Circle. The initiative to organize this event is unique because it is just not an academic ritual, but through this we seek to join in the global celebration of the Mahatma's 150th birth anniversary, revisiting his legacy and global relevance. Gandhi epitomizes the refinement and perfection that a person can attain. Rarely do we have persons who pursued truth in life as Gandhi in philosophy and action. Indeed, humanity has gained much from his moral wisdom, which was the basis of his action. His vision of truth and nonviolence, enduring commitment to social justice, normative economics, religious pluralism, and relentless striving for harmony between nature and human being have become extremely important in the context of today. It is important to revisit some of his aforementioned ideas to understand him and his worldview in the context of multiple challenges that confront us today. With this objective to deliberate upon Gandhi's legacy of inclusiveness that underlines Gandhi's philosophy, the idea of distinguished lecture series has been introduced. To deliver the inaugural lecture of this series, we are extremely honored to have Professor Akeel Bilgramy amongst us today. Welcome you, sir. Professor Bilgramy is a philosopher of international eminence and scholarship. He graduated from Elphinstone College, University of Bombay in 1970 and went to University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. Thereafter, he moved to the United States and earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago in 1983. He currently holds the Sidney Morgan Besser Chair in Philosophy at Columbia University. Professor Bilgramy was the chairman of the Department of Philosophy from 1994 to 1998. He has held many visiting fellowships at many universities across the world and has numerous awards and achievements to his credit. The paucity of time constrains me to speak about all of them. Professor Bilgramy works across two broad, typically separate areas of intellectual interest: philosophy of mind and language, and political philosophy and moral philosophy. His versatilities show us so in the range of works that he has not only produced, but the kind of provocations that he has made across many disciplines and areas. His writings and philosophical ideas on the theme of secularism, modernity, Marxism, and Gandhi have produced new perspectives on this and contributed significantly to our intellectual debates. His important works in the area include a vast number of essays and books, such as Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, Marx, Gandhi and Modernity, and Democratic Culture, Belief and Meaning, and Self-Knowledge and Resentment. There are many more. I can't name them all here. I must confess, I had little acquaintance of his genius till I read his scholarly work, Gandhi the Philosopher. In that influential essay, written over 2 decades back, Professor Bilgramy makes a fresh reading of Mahatma Gandhi as a philosopher and present him as a far deeper and far more original thinker than most readings on Gandhi think of him. Professor Bilgramy unearths the integrity in Gandhi's ideas, contrary to the popular notions of inconsistency and fragmentation in Gandhi. It is befitting, therefore, that in our constant endeavor to engage Gandhi's thought in practice, we have the good fortune to have Professor Akeel Bilgramy as a distinguished speaker. Not taking much of your time, I now invite Professor Bilgramy to deliver his keynote address on the theme Gandhi's Legacy of Our Time. Welcome, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kumar, and thank you. I'm very grateful to you and the principal's generous introduction. I'm very happy to be at Zakir Husain College. I've never spoken there before, and I'm really very pleased to be invited and to be here. Thank you very much for asking me. Can you hear me properly, everyone? Yes? I'd like to begin by saying we are living in an India that is about as far, which has fallen about as far away from Gandhi's ideas as anybody can imagine, especially in the last 6 or 7 years. Everything that Gandhi believed in about the nature of power, about the nature of a nation's sovereignty over itself, has been brutally put aside by the successive governments of the last few years, and so it's a very good time to be doing what your society is doing, which is raising questions about how far we have fallen off from his ideals and idea of India, and we should have a detailed sense of how that has happened and see what can be recovered of his ideals. Let me begin by mentioning 2 ideals of his, which a lot of people have written about, and some of the writing on Gandhi has become very good in the last few years. I want to begin, first of all, with his idea of power. Gandhi was not against power, but he had 2 different conceptions of power. One was himsa power, and the other was ahimsa power. Himsa power was the power of one over the other, the power of one over the other, what is sometimes called domination of one by the other. Ahimsa power was the power that comes from one working with another rather than power over another. His ideal of ahimsa power was the empowerments that were made possible by satyagraha, by constructed by the pluralistic life that you find in villages, and the constructed villages, which are ashrams. In that sense, he believed in empowerment. That is, people, for him, empowerment was people working with one another, and that was defined by contrast with the kind of power that one has, power of one against the other, or over the other. So this is a very important thing to understand. The ways in which one can forego one kind of power, that the one he cared for, and adopt the other kind of power that he was very deeply against. The second concept of his that I think is very important to keep in front of our minds, especially at a time like this, is the idea of Swadeshi, which really means sovereignty over our own lives. Swadeshi and Swaraj are linked concepts, but Swadeshi is particularly sovereignty over our economic lives, our sovereignty over our own economic lives. Have we lost the picture? Sorry. Can you see me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
So can you increase the audio sound a little?
Yes.
Audio.
I actually can't make it any louder.
Yeah, it's okay. It's fine.
All right. So I want to explore both these ideas in Gandhi and look at India, not just today, but today I think it's about as far as possible from these ideas. But I want to look at how these ideas played out historically as well. Now, one of the things you can ask is, if you look at how the national movement was mobilized, but Gandhi was very much in the forefront of the mobilization. Many of the mobilizations were his innovations. But of course, you've got to understand that millions of people were mobilized, and millions of people were mobilized had their reasons for being mobilized, and not everything came from Nehru and Gandhi and so on. They were mobilized. They had their own motivations. Millions of Kisans, and the question we always have to ask is,
क्या नहीं किया बेटा? क्या रखा था? ठंडा हो गया चाय? चाय गिर जाएगा, चाय हाथ लग जाएगा. चाय बेटा ये.
I request all of you to keep off your mic.
सुन रहे हैं? स्क्रीन कहाँ से लग गया?
is it okay?
आवाज आ रही है लेकिन. हाँ सुन रहे हैं.
Yes, you are audible, but may I request all of you to
हो रहा है. हाँ तो सुन रहे हैं.
switch off your audio.
उमा शंकर प्लीज म्यूट कर लीजिए. डॉक्टर उमा शंकर म्यूट प्लीज.
Please, everybody mute yourself. The speaker is.
डॉक्टर उमा शंकर जी प्लीज म्यूट योरसेल्फ.
Please, all of you, mute yourself. Yes, sir. Professor Bilgramy, you may continue now. Sorry for the disturbance.
That's all right. So one of the things we might ask is, Gandhi and others mobilized millions of people, mostly peasants, and did their dreams come true? Not just Gandhi's dreams, but did their dreams come true? Is a question you can't fail to ask. Because Gandhi's the heart of Gandhi's mobilizations were the people of India, the people in the uh, countryside and in the cities who came together in a remarkably creative mobilization. So we have to ask not just whether Gandhi's dreams were realized in independent India and down to this day, but were the peoples, the peasants, millions of India's population who made India's freedom possible, were their dreams realized? So you have to keep asking that question, and not just whether some leaders' ideals were mobilized, because a leader like Gandhi would have been insisted that the first thing to ask is, are people's dreams realized? So let's ask the question, how is it that we live in a society today in which there's so much distress you, of the farmers, of working people, and how could it be that we can say with any pride that what was sought in the freedom movement and the independence that we gained was realized in the independence that we gained? One of the things you might ask is, let's start with the failures of theorizing, of coming up with an understanding of what the state should be. You see, when you mobilize so many people, you have to ask, there's such a plurality of people that are being mobilized, and the politics that emerges, which is supposed to be representative of what the people think, they should be, in some sense, what any ideas of power, representation, and the state's power and its representative status of the people, is it exactly including the people in the way that power got constructed? And I think that the first failure to understand is that Gandhi's innovations of bringing together people in this remarkable way for almost 30 years of mobilization before 1947 was seeking a way of thinking of what governance would be in its mobilizations of resistance to British power. So whatever it is that they were seeking eventually to have could not just be what the kind of state and the kind of power relations that existed prior to independence in colonial rule. But the fact is that when we gained independence, we retained a great deal of the structures of the power of the state that existed prior to independence. And what was obvious was that implicit in Gandhi's mobilizations and in the people's aspirations, that were not always his aspirations, they have their own motivations, as I said, their aspirations and Gandhi's aspirations, to the extent that there was some coherence and coalescence between them, we have to ask, were these aspirations in some sense suggestive of an alternative conception of the nature of the state, of its relationship to governance, and under what circumstances it would be violent towards the people it governs, and so on. Was this in any way theorized correctly, such that after independence, Gandhi's ideas were, and the ideas of that come from the motivations of the millions he mobilized, were these realized in how the state was constructed, how the state was conceived after independence? And I think the first failure is that it was not at all conceived along the lines of promise that such a vast mobilization of such a pluralist population was suggestive of, was gearing itself towards. I mean, of course, implicitly, nobody had a theory, nobody had a model of that kind of state. But how is it that nothing, no alternative was developed in all the structures, a great deal of the structures? We got rid of the British, but a great deal of the structures of power, the same relation of the military to the people, the same relation of the police to the people, the same relation of the civil administrative service to the people. All of this was just simply carried over. And an alternative conception of the state, which was a promissory possibility in the movement itself, along Gandhian lines, was never really developed. That's a very, very deep failure. And you saw it again and again, that the kind of violence that the state produced. Look at what the state's violence was against the various peasant resistances all through the mid-60s and the 70s, early 70s. There was a great deal of peasant unrest in Bengal, in Andhra Pradesh, and so on. And the state was absolutely ruthless. I mean, it was as authoritarian towards the very peasantry that it had mobilized in the millions, which made our independence possible. That very peasantry was repeatedly brutalized for that period of 10 years when it sought to improve its conditions, especially in Bengal and Andhra Pradesh. So, I mean, and it was so brutally treated that it had to resort to its own violent reprisals. Then there was the emergency, which was also a symptom of the possibility of a state to suddenly emerge with this kind of tremendous brutality against its own people. But nothing of those two precedents that I've just mentioned, the emergency and the state's authority exercised in violent form against the peasantry, nothing compares to what's been happening in the last few years. In the last few years, what is really unique, I think, which did not exist before, is that I think the way to understand the state today is that it isn't just an ordinary authoritarian state of the kind that showed its real nature against the peasantry in the 60s and early 70s and in the emergency. Today, it's different because it is, I think, seriously pathological. It's a compulsive tick, the authoritarianism of today. Now, why do I say that? I think to understand this, you have to really invoke the Marxist thinkers Gramsci's idea of hegemony. Hegemony, when when Gramsci used that term, did not just mean overwhelming control and domination. That's how we loosely use the word, overwhelming control over somebody else, or comprehensive control over somebody else. That's how we use the term loosely. In Gandhi and in Gramsci, the term hegemony meant something much more specific. If you like, it was a technical term in his Marxist framework of understanding. But it's a very important thing to understand what he had in mind, because though his interest was in the concept of class, his idea of hegemony has a general significance. What he meant by hegemony is this: a ruling class, and he was interested in class, but we can talk about anything. A ruling dispensation, and he called it a ruling class because he was a Marxist. But let's work with this term, but we can use it more generally to talk more than just classes. A ruling dispensation or a ruling class gets to be the ruling class, Gramsci said, by convincing all other classes that its interests are the interests of all other classes. That's what he meant by hegemony. So for him, the idea was whoever rules, in his interest it was the class, gets to rule, gets to be the ruling class, because it has convinced all other classes that its interests are the interests of all other classes. When you have that, you've got Gramscian hegemony. Okay? Now, what's interesting about the Gramscian hegemony is that if you have it, and his point was, liberal democracies rule by this kind of hegemony. Liberal democracies, for him, in a capitalist economic formation, the political form of governance, which is liberal democratic governance, tends to be able to rule by this kind of hegemony, convincing whoever's ruling convinces everybody else that the interests of the ruling group or class is the interests of all groups and classes. Now, this government today in our country, I think it's fair to say that it has hegemony. That is, in many parts of the country, and certainly at the center, it has an overwhelming support in Parliament, representation in Parliament, and I think it's fair to say that that it has managed to convince a very large number of Indians of the Hindutva ideology in a way that certainly was not true. It began to be slowly grow only in the 1980s, late 1980s it started, and over 30, 40 years, it's now become something of a properly called hegemonic ideology. Many people from different groups, and increasingly the middle classes, but in many different groups, have bought into the idea of a Hindu nation, and are proud of the fact that a Ram Mandir will be built, and so on and so forth. And Ram Mandir is every time I speak to people, they say, Tarakki ho rahi hai, Ram Mandir ban raha hai, and so on. So there is a real sense of that this government has the support of its people, has convinced everybody that what its plans are for the country is what is good for everyone. Now, when you have this hegemony, when you have convinced people in this way, you don't need to be authoritarian, right? You only need to be authoritarian if you don't have Gramscian hegemony. But if you have this kind of consensus and you're still authoritarian, that's a sign that the authoritarianism is pathological. Right? That is, it's absolutely compulsive. And everywhere you find in the, I mean, you just see what happened, how every little bit of dissent by students, by journalists, by artists, all of them, public intellectuals, totally, any university dissent and so on is clamped down by the most brutal violence. So a government which boasts, and probably correctly boasts, that it has convinced others that its policies, its ideas and so on are the right thing for the country, for it to be brutal in the way it has when it doesn't have to be brutal because it has Gramscian hegemony, is a sign that this is a kind of pathological authoritarianism. And don't forget that the reason why fascism is called pathological is because the authoritarianism was compulsive. So that's a serious, substantial, measurable, qualitative difference as well from the authority that the two other kinds of authority that I was talking about earlier. Okay, so that's one very large thing to notice about absolutely, completely abandoning the idea of empowerment that comes from working with one another to adopting a notion of power where one has domination over another, and even in a compulsive form. I'm going to return to this later. Let's say a little bit now about another kind of failure. So far, I've only talked about the failure after independence to theorize a new form of state, which was a genuine alternative to the colonial state, and which developed the promise of new ideals of governance that would come from a fantastically creative mobilization of the kind that existed, a pluralist mobilization that existed through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, even to some extent before the 20s. It's a total failure to see what was possible as a new form of governance that came from that kind of mobilization. You see, you've got to remember that when Gandhi talks about means and ends, what he's really saying, I mean, there are all these cliches about how the ends don't justify the means, but really what Gandhi was saying by his talk of means and end was that the means are a seed and the ends are a flowering of that seed. And there's a real sense in which if the national movement was the means to independence, what I'm trying to say is that the national movement had the seeds of an alternative form of governance, of state power, of the state's relationship to its people. Right? The national movement was that kind of seed, but it never flowered into the seed. There was a mutation. I'm using this organic metaphor. There was a mutation. If the means to end idea in Gandhi was that the means should be are the seed, and the end should be a flowering of that seed, what it stood for, what its potentialities were. And I'm saying that the kind of seed that amazing movement was, with all its creative bringing together inclusively of so many different people, the flowering of that seed should have been a conception of rule, of relationship to people, of when and how violence is justified against the people, etc. Remember when Gandhi backed off from the violence of the movement from time to time, the infamous Chauri Chaura incident. All he was saying was, look, this is the seed to a flower, for a flower, which will flower. The seed can't be contaminated, right? And so what I'm saying is that anybody who was looking carefully at what the seed was a seed for, would realize that there was a mutation in what actually happened, and what flowered was not the creative possibilities of statehood, governance, power relations, and what the property of violence that a state could and should exercise was. Is not what is there in the freedom movement and its mobilizations. It was a betrayal of that. It was a mutation away from that organic flowering. Now, let's look at notions of Swadeshi for a moment, moving away from questions of power and himsa versus ahimsa power. Let's look at questions of Swadeshi. It's the basic idea is national sovereignty over one's own economy, and the stressing of indigenous possibilities of growth, but growth via the participation of people and not from agencies of profit making and so on, which were very much part of the discussion during the freedom movement. Now, here's a very interesting thing to look at when we look at the political economy. There's something I've been puzzled by, asked my economist friends, and I try and read up on it, but I never get any serious answer. It's a very difficult question. But I've been very curious about why, ever since independence, no form of political economy was creatively and theoretically developed in our thinking. Ever since 1947, that really understood the interests, aspirations, and conditions of the vast majority of people in the Indian countryside, the peasantry. Now, if you look at what political representation the peasantry got with any real success in the parliamentary field, the only one which stood up as a rival against the government, which stressed large industry, which had stressed the Soviet model. This was very much Nehru's ideal for India. The only alternative was with peasant leaders in the parliamentary field like Charan Singh, who were very much representative of a relatively small class of peasantry and very much committed to a capitalist form of agriculture. So my question is, why wasn't it that any other understanding of how to bring the peasant classes, which were at that time the vast majority of the country, how to bring their interests and aspirations, how to improve their conditions, why is it that only somebody like Charan Singh, who represented a very small section of this and had a very, very capitalist conception of how to promote the interests of the peasantry. Why was there never any other alternative to the model that was adopted with so much enthusiasm by under Nehru's influence, which is very much the Soviet model of industrialization imposed from the top. It's a complete mystery to me why this was never developed, why there's this complete vacuum of peasant interests, except in this completely distorting form of somebody like Charan Singh. Why? Why was something like, when 80% of the population was not an urban population, why were their interests not theoretically modeled? An alternative political economy, conception of political economy was never devised. How can the interests of so many people not be represented in any theorizing done by and adopted as a possibility, right? It didn't even have any politicians, parties representing it in any serious, effective way. I mean, I don't doubt that land reforms did occur in some parts of the country, mostly under communist control. But putting aside Bengal and Kerala for the moment, why was there not at the national level any party, any representative of an alternative to this dichotomy between the peasant interests as understood in this narrowing way by Charan Singh and the standard Congress Party government's adoption of a highly industrialized model for economic development? Why? Now, really, things go back quite far in this. If you want to diagnose how this happened, if you look at it in the late 1930s, I think it was after the Wardha Congress, a national planning commission was set up in the late 1930s. I think it was called by Subhash Chandra Bose, but Nehru was its chairman, and it had all sorts of people in it. It had people from it was an expert committee. It was intended as an expert committee. It had economists. It had captains of industry. It had people from the capitalist class who were representing it. It had one person. It had a labor leader, N.M. Joshi, in it. It had one person who was a Gandhian. That's Kumarappa, a very interesting figure, J.C. Kumarappa. And it's fascinating if you look at what happened. Anything Kumarappa said was just immediately silenced. And Kumarappa was arguing for things that I'm saying might have had some understanding of what the peasants' aspirations were, what their needs were. And this is partly Nehru's doing, that Nehru was so enamored by the Soviet model that Kumarappa was pretty much sidelined, almost laughed out of that commission of experts. And already what had happened was that the very idea of planning was not an idea that, or the very body by which planning was conceived and constructed. I'm talking about the late 1930s. I'm not even talking about the independence period. Already, the very concept of planning was the concept of something that would be done by experts and would not be drawn from the political struggles and the political aspirations and needs in the political field where the mobilization was taking place. These are the people who won freedom for us, but what their aspirations were completely, it was not the field where decisions were going to be made about how to plan growth and development.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes?
Sir, your voice is not coming.
The voice is not coming.
No, it's clear. I think there is some connectivity problem on your part. Sir's voice is absolutely clear. Yeah, please
Sir,
mute
voice is
yourself.
coming.
Yeah, please mute yourself. Sir, you are absolutely clear. Your voice is clear.
You're clear? Okay. All right. So the other question that I have then is, right from the late 30s, the idea of the political economy and its main agency, i.e. planning, was conceived as something done by experts independently of the political field of political struggles. And it was going to be done by people who had made up minds. I mean, it was obvious that Kumarappa's ideas were never going to be taken seriously, that large-scale industrialization was spoken for by the majority of the people on that commission. Nehru took the lead on this. And Gandhi, and this is very clear, Gandhi wrote to Nehru and said, I don't see that what's happening. He says, I'm completely in the dark. The working committee of the Congress is completely in the dark about what's going on in that committee. Nobody knows what's going on in that committee, right? And it was clear that Gandhi was saying that you can't have an understanding of development, growth, planning, which is done at a level of autonomy which is not coming out of, not emerging from the movement that the people had allowed the National Congress to lead them into. So it's not at all surprising that today you can have this disgraceful government completely dismantling even Nehru's ideas of planning and so on, which, I mean, by now, things have changed a lot. The proportions in the economy of the peasantry after so much industrialization, urbanization, and so on, things have changed considerably. But the point is that when you have divorced the models of governance, in this case of political economy, completely from the struggles of the people and made it some self-standing thing, then even Nehru's ideas could be completely dismantled. And the very, because it's an autonomous, self-standing thing. It doesn't emerge from people's struggles, people's wants, and so on. And I think the fault line goes back to the late 30s, when the very idea of planning was conceived. So what is happening today, when there's absolutely no possibility of humane state intervention to meet the needs of the people, where everything, every kind of subsidy, every kind of humane policy towards the people is being dismantled, because planning itself, the very idea of the center intervening in a humane way has gone. But I think the fault line is partly that the very concept of planning was something that Gandhi said to Nehru. You are setting up something which is not coming from the people's struggles, people's aspirations. We have mobilized these peoples, and you're doing something which is completely divorced from the aspirations and goals that the people seem to be articulating in the mobilization. So So I think that's the second line of betrayal of the creative possibilities of the national movement. I don't want to just talk about Gandhi. I want to talk about the movement itself and of the people's role in it. So that's the second thing, and so it doesn't surprise me that the only possibility of representing the peasantry for all those years after independence came with people like Charan Singh, who were just as distant in a different way, distant from Gandhian aspirations for the peasantry. So in these two ways, the creative possibilities in Gandhi were not developed. And we are seeing, both in the authoritarianism and the betrayal of the people's interests today, which have gone to an extreme that is really as far away, as I said, from Gandhian ideals as is possible. Okay, so those are the two large questions I wanted to raise and puzzles that I have. Sanjeev Kumar, Sahib, can you tell me how much time should I have? Should I stop and take questions, or shall I speak some more? I'm in your hands. You should tell me what you would like me.
Yeah, sir, you can please speak. I think you can speak for another 15 to 20 minutes, and then we can open this floor for discussion. So we can have 30 minutes for discussion. Maybe 15, 20 minutes you can continue, sir. I think it's a very interesting discussion that we are having.
Okay.
So I think we may continue.
All right. So the third thing that what one should really talk about too, and which really does, I'm going to find it hard to express this because it's not something that I've thought through very fully myself. But one of the things that puzzles everybody, and I think it's worth thinking about, and so here I'm going to be much more speculative, and I don't have many definite questions, but I'd really be very curious to put it in the air and get your impression of how one should think about it. You see, many people ask the question, Gandhi was really against, against is the wrong word. Gandhi was relatively indifferent to two things like rights, constitutions, and citizenship in the formal sense of what is constituted by the law, the constitution, and codes of that kind. I think Gandhi's view was that this was perhaps a necessity, but it's not the goal of politics to make human beings into citizens. Human beings are human beings. You don't make people better by making them into citizens. Now, Gandhi, I'm actually quoting him when I say that. People don't become better just by being made into an abstract form of being called citizen. So one of the things that I want to ask is, what did he have in mind when he said, fine, you can have your parliament, fine, you can have your constitutions, but it's not what the ultimate goal of political achievement is. And here, one way to think about it also is to ask the question, I've been very intrigued because many people on the left, my colleagues, in a way, my intellectual comrades on the left, many people think that Nehru's book, Discovery of India, is his most disappointing book. I think it's by far his most interesting and his best book. I mean, Nehru wrote a lot, wrote very well, but this is undoubtedly his best and most interesting book. Now, I feel it's the most interesting book because Nehru was saying in it, its main point is that the Indian past the Indian past that makes the idea of India so significant is its, and this is his term, is its unself-conscious pluralism. Now, I want to stress the word unself-conscious. You see, it's this unself-conscious pluralism that Nehru was saying was India's past. That's what got destroyed in the 1980s. In the 1980s, you saw a kind of nationalism that was really mimicking Europe. It was not the nationalism of the national movement, but it was a new nationalism that emerged in the 1980s, and it was just simply a mimicry of Europe. In Europe, people began to get a feeling for the nation by finding an external enemy inside. The Protestant and Catholic countries, the Catholic and Protestant countries, the Jews, the Irish. These were people who were considered external enemies inside the country. They must be hated, they must be put down, they must be violently put down. And the nation is ours, not theirs. A standard European model of nationalism. That began here in the 1980s. Find the external enemy, Muslim. The nation is ours, not theirs. Now, that was a destruction of what Nehru was saying was India's past, the unself-conscious pluralism. Now, when that happened and our unself-conscious pluralism was destroyed, the importance of a self-conscious doctrine like secularism became urgent. So secularism is a self-conscious correction to repair the damages of the destruction of an unself-conscious pluralism by this kind of majoritarian religious nationalism. Now, I'm saying all this because it shows that the idea of secular rights, citizenship, and so on, very important when you've got the unself-conscious pluralism has been destroyed. It's very important to have precisely the law, the constitution, the idea of citizenship, etc., self-consciously brought in. So you've got to understand that these things that are brought in a very self-conscious way, these codes, constitutions, etc., are there to repair a damage of the loss of unself-conscious pluralism. They're self-conscious correction of the loss of an unself-conscious pluralism, of the undermining of an unself-conscious pluralism by this Hindu nationalist thing in India or in Europe, other forms of chauvinistic nationalism. Now, Gandhi's view was, it's fine. You need these ideas of citizenship and so on to correct that if that happens. But it can't become a self-standing phenomenon. It's a foreground phenomenon. It's a foreground phenomenon to correct damage. But that damage is the falling away from a different ideal, which is an unself-conscious pluralism of the past. Right? So Gandhi's view was, the whole point of codes and constitutions was to make a correction, but the ultimate background ideal of an unself-conscious way of living together, working together, what I was calling ahimsa power, that's the real background which we are trying to restore. It isn't as if all these rights and constitution citizenship are a totally self-standing autonomous phenomena. They're really working to correct the damage and restore us to this background ideal of living and working together, of of uh, of relations of a kind that are not dictated by constitution's laws, just unself-consciously living together. Think of it this way. I mean, I'll put it a little more theoretically. Nietzsche, the philosopher, wrote a remarkable book. It was an early work of his. I think it's his best work, called The Birth of Tragedy. And in it, he distinguished between the Dionysian and the Apollonian. The Apollonian is what he called the representation. So in my remarks just now, it would be the constitution, the codes, the laws of a nation. The Dionysian is the non-discursive, non-representational background, which makes possible even conceiving of this. But really, the ultimate ideal is Dionysian, which is non-representational. So, I mean, Nietzsche was talking about how he was interested partly in Greek tragedies, partly interested in Wagner. And his idea was that the more the arts became representational, the less they understood their Dionysian background, which is the non-codified, unself-conscious relations with one another. That's a very deep point, actually. Philosophically, that's a very deep point. The main idea, and when Gandhi says you've reduced human beings to citizenship, what he means is the ultimate goal has to get us back to being human. Right? It can't be to make us, citizenship can't be a self-standing, autonomous, new way of being. It isn't. If it has any point, it is just to correct us to go back to something which is unself-conscious. That's a very important point to understand, I think, about why he was indifferent to some of these ideas of parliament, constitutions, etc., rights, and so on. I think it's very, here, let me give you an example of how this, take something like the transitional justice case in South Africa. What Bishop Tutu and others understood was, look, this is not an ordinary case of justice. We are dealing with people who've committed vast crimes against freedom, against people's welfare, and for a very long time under settler colonialism of a brutally racist regime. And Tutu was saying, yes, we've got to judge these people, and we've got laws and so on, but we've got to live side by side with these people. We're not going to incarcerate a whole hundreds and hundreds of leaders, and in fact, most of the population was complicit in apartheid. So what you're going to do? Incarcerate everybody? So Tutu tried to devise a way of thinking which said, listen, let's not do this in a codified way. Let's not treat these people as something to which codes, laws, and so on apply, and see them as silently sitting in the dock as we forensically investigate them by a detached form of inquiry. Right? Rather, what should happen in this transitional form of justice is to create a completely different atmosphere. No codes, constitutions, no applying of criminal law, nothing like that. Let's have an engaged, unself-conscious conversation with them in a purely confessional atmosphere where the point should be healing. not verdicts, not forensic judgments, but going back to human possibilities of living side by side, what Gandhi called ahimsa, empowerment of people to work with one another, completely unself-consciously, right? Just living side by side. That's the ultimate goal of why human beings should be made into citizens, to recover their humanity. Okay, so Tutu's and his colleagues' idea was, let's just have the people not being forensically investigated and asked formal questions saying, just answer the question, etc., that happens in criminal justice. Rather, it should be a completely confessional thing. We should engage in a totally unself-conscious relations with them in the process of coming to a transitional justice with South African independence. This is a remarkable ideal. And it failed for all sorts of reasons, which I can't go into now. But I only mention it because it's really, he was applying, explicitly applying Gandhi's ideals of these unself-conscious relations. And, you know, it's really what Heidegger means by the background. And here's a very interesting thing. I'm going to say this and stop, because it's, in a way here, you see, somebody like Gandhi is much deeper than somebody like Foucault. Because Foucault's view is that the Enlightenment and its codes and constitutions, his view is that they just have come and taken over the very idea of penalty, and they've created a universal discipline of punishment, and that's a change from old discretionary forms of legal relations. The magistrates had so much discretion, they could say, let the poor fellow go. You know, in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the idea of Enlightenment penalty was, we've got to get that guy. You know, Inspector Javert says, we've got to get that guy no matter what, because the law says it, right? And you know, Foucault's idea was, well, you know, the guy just took a loaf of bread 8 years ago. Just let him go. You know, what is that? It's nothing. No discretion. We've got the law. The law must be applied. All right. So his idea was this. But Gandhi's view was deeper, because what he was saying was, look, all these possibilities of codes and constitutions are just the foreground. The background which makes it possible are ordinary human relations, which continue to exist all the time. They continue to exist now. It's just that they don't exist in the public sphere. Right? They've been spoiled by Hindu nationalism or European forms of nationalism. They've been spoiled, and the law was brought in to correct this damage. But in everyday life, people live together. And that's what Bishop Tutu was trying to restore. So there's a whole Dionysian, non-discursive, unself-conscious set of human relations, which exist even today, even in the post-Enlightenment period, says Gandhi. They're there in everybody, in ordinary quotidian forms of life, in the ashram, in the villages, in popular religion. All of this goes on, but in the interstices, in quotidian moments, you will find them. In quotidian places, quotidian moments, you'll find them. You can't completely fall off them, because it's really what makes us human. But you can fall off them to a considerable extent, and really what Foucault failed to see was that the right way to put his anxieties about the Enlightenment and its form of law and penalty, the right way to put it is that the Enlightenment was taking the foreground and thinking it's all the ground there is. Whereas Gandhi's point was, Gandhi's understanding of the nature and point of politics, the goal, ultimate goal of politics was that no, the foreground is made possible because we have a background of unself-conscious human relations. We may have fallen away from that ideal in public life, but it's what it is. It is what makes us human. Our capacities and so on lie in those, the possibilities of those relations. And so the point of rights and so on, and parliaments and constitutions, can only be that it can never cover all the ground, and there are always possibilities that we can tap and scale up in the background, and the Dionysian or the non-discursive, ordinary, unself-conscious relations of unalienated human relations is the ultimate goal of politics, even when the foreground must be brought in to sometimes achieve it. That's very much part of Gandhi's thinking, and Foucault didn't quite see that in the anxieties he had about the Enlightenment. Okay, I'm going to stop now.
The floor is now open for the questions. Biprajit?
First of all, thank you so much, sir, for all the wonderful insights that you have provided us with on this evening, and you have surely enlightened and enriched our evening of Gandhi Jayanti 2020. Before we move on, before we move on to taking on questions and opening the floor to questions from all those who have been watching us, there has been quite a lot of discussion on the chat box while you were giving us your words of wisdom, and I would like to ask if any of the professors that have joined here, the scholars who have joined us here on this webinar, would like to ask any kind of questions to Sir Bilgramy and Dr. Shakti P. Rawat, Dr. Maithili Rao. If you all have any kind of questions, I would invite you to please pose your questions to Sir so that Bilgramy Sir can answer your queries, and we can set the tone right for the question answer session. Om Prakash Sir. Professor Ishi, if you would like to ask any kind of question to Sir Bilgramy before we open the floor to others.
I think I'm seeing a message saying that there are questions in something called the chat box.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions for you on the chat box. I will certainly read that out. Before that, as Aarti had already said, if anyone would like to ask you a question directly through the video message, we would take that first, or else we'll move on to reading out the question.
Good evening. Can I go ahead with a question?
Yes, ma'am. Please.
Very good evening to all. Thank you, sir, for this fascinating lecture. This is Dr. Simple Mahanti. I teach in Shahid Bhagat Singh College, and I especially liked your the way you brought out this idea about this unsubconscious human relationships in the background who have been neglected. I would just like to know a little more from you. You mentioned about how Hindu nationalism has been mimicking European nationalism. So I would like you to elaborate a little more, or maybe a few instances of just know a little more on the resonance between the two. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very important thing to try and understand. You see, in Europe, much of this nationalism grew for a very specific dialectic, in a very specific way. I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding. There's a kind of, I think, obtuse, absolutely obtuse attributes of this kind of nationalism to Romanticism. There was a very, very seriously confused philosopher called Isaiah Berlin, who attributed to the kind of irrationalism that came with Romanticism. Isaiah Berlin was very fascinated by Romanticism, but he was also made very anxious by it. It's a total distortion of Romanticism. Some of the people who were most against imperialism were Romantics like Humboldt and Herder, who actually said the West does not know it all, and it's very important to learn from other parts of the world. And that a great deal of the Romantics' interest in the exotic and so on was that maybe the West will be able to lose some of its identity and acquire some of the knowledges and identities of other places through its travels and it was against conquest. Humboldt was one of the most humane people. And Berlin just has a tin ear. Berlin was basically a Cold Warrior. He thought all of the Soviet Union ideas came from Slavic Romanticism. It's just really, really ideological distortion. The idea of the trajectory of nationalism in Europe is nothing to do with Romanticism. Romanticism was exploited. The idea of folk was exploited by German Romanticists of much, by German nationalists in the 1930s and 40s. It was exploited by them. But it's absurd to lay the fault line of it in ideas in Herder and Humboldt. The real dialectic by which European nationalism emerged was because after theological justifications for state legitimacy, state power, were undermined by the new sciences in the 17th century, new forms of justification for how to legitimize the state had to be devised. And they were devised not in political theology, because nobody could really believe in the divine rights of the state as it was personified by the kings and queens. But they had to find a new field to justify it. It couldn't be theology anymore with the rise of the sciences. So it was a kind of political psychology that was brought in to justify state power. And the political psychology used a fusion of the idea of a state, which became more and more centralized after the 17th century, the mid-17th century. In fact, if I'm right, the first nationwide tax was only done in the interregnum by Cromwell. That was in the 1650s. And that's when state was becoming more and more centralized, integrating very scattered locations of power. And that happened at the same time after Westphalia, when the centralized state was fused with the idea of a nation, with a new entity that had emerged after the Westphalian peace. So you had this fused concept of a nation-state. And because the state got more, had integrated scattered locations of power into a centralized model, and a new form of entity had emerged, and these two fused into something which were inseparable. You had the nation-state. And so state power began to be legitimized by creating a feeling, not for the state directly, but for the left-hand side of this hyphenated conjunction, the nation, and because they were fused, a feeling for the nation legitimized the state, which was the state that was fused or tied to the nation. So the question is, how was this done? How did you create a feeling for the left-hand side of this hyphenated conjunction nation-state? And everywhere in Europe, it was done by saying, that by finding an external enemy within the territory that the state was controlling and saying, the nation is ours, not theirs, as I said. Right? So this is what people like Edward Said call the other. You know, you create the other and you say it is ours, not theirs. Now, actually, it's not Edward Said, it was Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir who first used the term other in these ways. Now, so this was the method by which nationalism emerged. Right? The state is ours, not theirs. You find an external enemy within to be able to say that and subjugate. Now, much of the time, the majority, I mean, later on, when numerical forms of discourse were introduced into the study of societies, these came to be called majorities and minorities. This began to be called majoritarianism. Very often it was religious majoritarianism. As I said, Protestants in Protestant countries were doing this to the Catholic minorities, vice versa in Catholic countries, and so on. So that was the history of Europe after Westphalia. Right? Nothing to do with Romanticism. This is just the trajectory of state legitimizing exercises of nation building. And India did not have that. I mean, Gandhi's claim was India's never had that kind of nation building. So and Nehru's whole point in discovery of India was India has this unself-conscious pluralism. We never went through this undermining of the unself-conscious pluralism that Europe went through these nation-building exercises. Right? So for us, nationalism is anti-imperialism. Muslims are joining in. We've got the Khilafat movement where the Muslims are involved. We've got the Muslim mass contact program where the Muslims are involved. We're all part of a single movement. And where is the destruction? So I believe that this kind of nationalism really began in the 1980s in India. And it began in the 1980s for all sorts of reasons. They're very complex reasons, but one very, very salient reason is because after the Mandal Commission, it was exposed that Hinduism is a very, very divided society, very divided religion, because there were all these caste divisions which went very, very deep in Hinduism. And so upper caste Hindus made a very concerted effort in the parliamentary field, in the cultural field, in the grassroots movements that the RSS had started, in the cultural field with the VHP, in the parliamentary field with the increasingly strong BJP. And they made a very concerted effort to say that really we are not divided. Hinduism is not divided. We really are unified, and the real enemy is the Musliman. And so it was a reaction to what was exposed by the Mandal Commission and the politics that was followed in the aftermath of the Mandal Commission. It was to fight that exposure and that political set of developments through the Mandalization of politics, that this kind of Hindutva was Hindu nationalism mimicking Europe began. That's one trajectory. You know, there are other trajectories too. I mean, I think the Hindu right showed a lot of courage against the emergency, and they got a moral high ground they never had before. And they entered into a respectability, and that's when the BJP began to have much more power than the Jan Sangh had. And they got a kind of respectability in the parliamentary field and in the minds of people, because the center-left was absolutely cowardly in the emergency, and they were much more powerful than they are now. But the Hindu right showed some courage. So they became part of the mainstream in a way that they never had before. All these things emerged in the 80s. And that's when we really began to mimic the history of Europe.
Thank you so much, sir, for the answer that you have provided. We have certainly 2 or 3 more questions that have been posed in the chat box for you. Mr. Praveen Dhanda has posed a question for you, and I see him live on the camera. So, Mr. Praveen, if you would like to ask a question yourself to sir, it would be wonderful.
Okay. Sir, thank you for this wonderful lecture. You mentioned Charan Singh while mentioning Gandhi's ideas on political economy. Could you please give us a few points on how Charan Singh's ideas were incongruent with Gandhi on the issue of political economy? And what can we read more on this subject? Thank you so much.
Oh, all my reading. See, when I was growing up in Bombay, I read, I mean, you had to read the mainstream newspaper, but there were 3 or 4 things that I read every day. One was a daily newspaper edited by Aruna Asif Ali called The Patriot. And I read a very, very boring but quite informative magazine called Link. And I think I occasionally read something called Mainstream. This is where I learned all my politics. You know, I read that I can't remember if Link came out every week or every 2 weeks, maybe every week. I'm not sure, but so all my reading of this has come from what I just read every week in the period that I was there. But I'm sure that there are things you can read about the politics of that time. But I remember constantly thinking, and why is it that Charan Singh, who really stood for, pretty much the middle and upper crust of the peasantry, and had very, very distinctly capitalist understandings of agriculture, why was he the only figure to emerge as some kind of opposition to the Nehruvian ideas of Soviet-style industrialization? I mean, why was this ridiculously impoverished dichotomy of options? Why? And it's really not, it's something I don't understand. I mean, economists should be able to, but I think economists should pose this question, ask this question: why is it that nothing else developed?
Thank you so much, sir, for that answer. Before I move on to another question from the chat box, is there anyone else who would like to ask or pose their question directly to sir? If not, I'll move on.
So I have a
May I
question.
ask a
Hello.
question? May I ask a question?
Yeah, can we do it one by one? Can you please tell us your name and then proceed with the question?
I am Alok Tandon. May I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Professor Bilgramy, my question is that do you see any future for secularism in India? And if not, is there we are in the offing of a fascism of European variety?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a distinct anxiety.
I am asking from Bilgram, your ancestral place nearby.
So, look, in last winter, there was a very serious nationwide movement. It didn't go right into the countryside, but it was there in all the major cities, in many of the small towns. There was a very, very fascinating, morale-boosting, tremendous movement of young people, Muslims, women, Muslim women, in the Maidans, in the squares, of even small towns, leave alone the major towns. It was remarkable. It was a nationwide movement. I mean, it didn't penetrate to the countryside, but of course it was brought to an end by the pandemic. And I believe that that movement was remarkable in a way that it went beyond Gandhi and Nehru and Ambedkar for the following reason. That movement was arguing for the goal of restoring secular citizenship. Its claims were, we have a constitution. You can't betray the constitution. Just go back to the ideals of the constitution. And so it was arguing for secularism, for secular citizenship, right? Not the kind of destruction of secular citizenship. It was arguing against the destruction of secular citizenship that was coming by this pincer movement of the NRC and the CAB, which became the CAA. And of course, also the demographic manipulations that were happening in Kashmir through the manipulations of the central government there. These young people and activists and so on were really remarkable for arguing for secular citizenship. But what's fascinating is that they were doing it with the methods. And if you look at how they did it, if you look at their slogans, the posters, the public form of address, Kabir chants and so on, they were really tapping India's unself-conscious pluralism, right? They were tapping popular religion of all different non-sectarian kinds, bringing in a completely inclusive religious set of slogans, chants, art, and so it was using this unself-conscious pluralism to argue. In a way, it was combining what I was calling the Dionysian and the Apollonian, the unself-conscious cultural past to argue for very abstract constitutional legal demands of citizenship. Now, that combination was never achieved by Gandhi, Nehru, or Ambedkar. Remember, Gandhi was, as I said, indifferent to constitutions and codes, etc. Right? Nehru, in his book Discovery of India, admired the pluralism, of the unself-conscious pluralism, and he admired the constitutional secular rights of citizenship, etc. But for him, these two worked in completely different gears. They were totally different trajectories of his thought. He admired them both, but they were parallel. They were not fused as they were by the student. And Ambedkar was a master, tremendously powerful and creative legislator. And his understanding of the Constitution was basically, Ambedkar was one of the first, if not the first, thinker of affirmative action anywhere in the world. He was an affirmative action theorist of a very creative, very early pioneer of affirmative action legislation. But he was rather suspicious. Remember, people like the early Varkaris and Kabir and all, who were very much part of this mix of pluralist public address that the activists last winter were doing, Ambedkar was relatively skeptical of the capacity for bhakti ideals and the Varkaris and so on to undermine caste. He was really a legislator. So for him too, these were very separate things, the pluralism of popular religion and this. These students brought it together. These young people brought it together, and it was a nation which was developing into a real nationwide movement. And I think that's a remarkable bringing together of the ideals of secular citizenship with our pluralist past. Fantastic integration. I have nothing but admiration for what happened, and it's one of the great tragedies that it had to be stopped by as a result of this pandemic. And I hope it will revive. But it was for secular citizenship, and if movements like that pick up again and so on, then there's some future that we can be hopeful for.
So moving on with some more questions from the chat box that are there.
I think I have a question. Can I ask a question? Hello?
So we'll take the questions that have been posed before already, and if we have time, we'll also take your questions. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, but
that's all right.
We'll have to go that way. Thank you so much. So, sir, I'll club two questions which have been asked by Mr. Anubhav Srivastava and Mr. Padmashri Niranjan. So, the question asked by Padmashri Niranjan is basically a subset of the question asked by Anubhav Srivastava. The broader question is, how do you think that Gandhi's thought is practical in the 21st century, and how effective will be if it is implemented in the near future at any time from now on? And the question that Padmashri Niranjan poses, which can be considered a subset, is the idea of participatory democracy at the grassroots level. That is basically manifestation of the Gram Panchayat. So on that note, how well do you think would be the implementation, and how practical and pragmatic do you think will a Gandhian approach be in the 21st century?
A lot depends on what you mean by that. I think Gandhi was very practical. I can't hear myself.
Please kindly mute yourself.
Yeah, Alok Tandon, to mute yourself.
Yeah.
Look, Gandhian ideas, let us just take, you say 21st century. What is the biggest problem facing the 21st century? The biggest problem for the whole globe is the environmental crisis. If something is not done to address this crisis, right, future generations will not have a future. Right? That's the largest global problem that's faced. So by the whole world. Okay. Who had ideas that were environmentalist ideas as early as Gandhi, apart from Gandhi? You can count them in the fingers of one hand. Right? Something has to be done. Right? But who? Who had ideas which are relevant today? Who? I mean, Gandhi was one of the first to have ideas that are relevant today. If Gandhi's ideas that I said when Kumarappa got sidelined and so on, if those ideas were pursued all over the world, there would not have been a crisis of the kind we are facing, or it would have been considerably mitigated. Now, you see, the idea of practical, I mean, you've got to ask the question, before you ask about what is practical and what is not, you've got to remember that people are constantly accusing others whom they oppose of believing in things that are nostalgic, that can never happen. It's too late. But think of this. Medieval scholastics. So medieval scholastics constantly accused the creative people in the Renaissance of nostalgia for a bygone classical era. All the time. The most creative people in the Renaissance were accused of being impractically, nostalgically yearning for a bygone age, for a classical age. Right? Well, who won? And what gets counted as nostalgic and hopeless and so on is very ideologically selected. Right? To say it's too late to do something now. Maybe it was feasible when Gandhi was writing in 1909 in Swaraj, but it's not feasible now, right? That's the standard thing. It's nostalgic now to think it can be done. It's too late. But what gets counted as too late is very ideologically chosen. So Israel keeps saying, you can't go back to 1967 borders. It's too late. There's too many settlements. So you'll never get justice there if you really believe it's too late. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But notice that nobody said it's impractical and it's too late. When the Soviet Union and its allies had nationalized private property, made it public ownership, nobody said, oh, it's too late. That part of the world, private property is impossible. It's gone. It's a thing of the past. It's public ownership, it's state ownership, it's... Nobody said that. They went after the Soviet Union relentlessly. They committed violence in Vietnam. They commit violence in Latin America, every corner of the globe, until the Soviet experiment and the socialist experiment fell apart. Why didn't people say it's too late? That private property is a thing of the past in that part of the world. They didn't say that. So what gets said to be too late and what doesn't get said to be too late is completely ideologically selected by people in power, by corporations, by what India loves to call vested interests. I mean, I don't have any solutions, but I think what happened last winter in the mobilizations was people who said, nothing's too late. We're going to fight for secular citizenship. It's in the Constitution. There's nothing nostalgic about going about it. Let's fight for what we already committed ourselves to in the Constitution. So there's nothing else to do to make it practical, but to force the government's hand. You know, Machiavelli said, Machiavelli advised the prince, and he said, the best way to deal with the people, he told the prince, the best way to deal with the people is not to make them love you, because love depends on giving them freedom to choose whether they love you or not. Much better, he said, to make them fear you, because fear comes helplessly. You don't give them freedom. Fear, they fear you when they're helpless. Much better not to give them freedom and love them, and have them love you. Better to have them fear you, because then you don't give them freedom and autonomy. Right? That was his advice to the prince. But who is advising the people? The people should get the same advice. It's in the mobilizations that the practical emerges. Gandhi saw that. You have to make the state fear you through your mobilizations and through your movements. It's just good Machiavellian advice. It's only if you mobilize, if you organize, and take to the activism that is organized in that way, that you will get the state to respond. That's what makes things practical. There's nothing else that can make something that seems unrealistic practical. We have no other means.
Thank you so much, sir, for that answer. One last question from the chat box, and we'll take a direct question at the end if we have time. The question from the chat box is quite simple and quite direct, as to say, Dr. Shakti P. Raut from Ramlal Anand College asks you that if you would explain a little more or elucidate a little more on the counter-modernity model of Gandhian idea in the context of self-reliant India. So she wants you to explain on that plot of self-reliance read in parallel with the model of counter-modernity that exists in the Gandhian idea.
Right. So, you see, India is very lucky to be a large country with very diverse resources. So, unlike many smaller countries of the South, which have, often have at most one commodity that they can rely on. So if India was to be self-reliant, then as some economists have argued, like Samir Amin and our own economist Prabhat Patnaik, they have been arguing, I think, very plausibly, but it's interesting that only Southern economists argue this. Economists of the North, even radical economists of the North, don't argue this. Perry Anderson never argues it. Joseph Stiglitz never argues it. None of the new, even Varoufakis doesn't argue it, even though he was totally clubbed into defeat by the mafia corporate banking elites of Brussels and Frankfurt. So people like Samir Amin and Patnaik have been saying self-reliance comes from delinking from the global finance capital. And for many reasons, but one obvious reason is that if you're part of that system and you try and do anything progressive, then you have to constantly be afraid of capital flight. As many left-wing governments discovered, Lula in Brazil, these are very salient, instructive examples. And so, yes, self-reliance does mean delinking, but you see, we are relatively lucky in India because we have, we are a large country with a diverse portfolio of resources. It's not true of smaller countries. So I think many countries of the South will have to form South links to help smaller countries of delinking from the global financial system of neoliberalism, which is a new form of imperialism of the North over the South. So those are the issues that are really at stake in this question about self-reliance. That's what Gandhi meant by Swadeshi, or sovereignty over one's own political economy. And we are relatively privileged because we have a diversified economy, relatively speaking, compared to other Southern economies.
All right, so before we end this wonderful Q&A session with you, we'll have a last question by Ankit sir from our college itself. So sir, if you're here, please pose your question to Bilgramy sir.
Thank you, Viparijit. Thank you, Professor Bilgramy, for this wonderful talk. Now, I have a question or a kind of curiosity to know more about this transition from unself-conscious pluralism to self-conscious pluralism, which you said happened at mid-80s, and then what we are witnessing today is complete turnabout of both unself and self-conscious pluralism. I'm more interested to know what led to its loss, both from sociological perspective and from political perspective. The reason why I'm asking this, because every time when I go back to my society and the place where I come from, I see intergenerational decline of this idea of unself-conscious of living together. So my grandfather withheld this idea very strongly vis-a-vis my father, who has some weak links with this, to my uncle, who has completely no link to this, and to me, since I have been socialized in a different atmosphere like JNU, so I hold with this idea. That is completely different level. So can you explain me why this became so weak, why this link was so weak? And secondly, at level of political, and there I was noting down your response to Professor Simple Mohanty. I have a kind of challenge to this thesis. So you, in response to her question, you said that it was due to the rise of OBC politics, this unself-conscious of living together, had a kind of and it deteriorated away because of that factor. Now, if this was the case, caste exploitation, gender exploitation
No,
has been.
Stop, wait for a minute. That's just completely not what I said.
Okay, sorry, sir. Sorry. Then. Yeah. So, I mean, I was then, it was a mistake then, sir. Sorry. So, can you explain me some political aspect and the cultural aspect and sociological aspect for the decline of this unself-conscious of living together? I'm really sorry if I got you wrong. I mean, it's also because of the poor internet connection that.
Well, look, it's what I said was that the politics, the aftermath of Mandal was a politics which greatly democratized India. Right? And it was a politics in which many groups who were hitherto powerless and underprivileged got to have some power and privilege, or some progress. So it was, and all sorts of demand making was made possible by people from the state, demanding from the state, which never happened before. So it was a tremendously democratizing period that began in the 80s that did not exist in the Nehruvian period or immediately. What I said was that what Mandal exposed, what some of the OBC based political parliamentary representation exposed, was how divided Hinduism was, how divided Hindu society was by caste. And it's that exposure that the whole Hindu ideology was then mobilized, both in the parliamentary level and in the cultural field and in the grassroots, building on things that RSS had already been building in the grassroots. You see, you've got to understand that the Congress Party lost its grassroots during the period just before emergence. With Indira Gandhi, just let me finish. With Indira Gandhi and her son, Sanjay Gandhi, the grassroots that the Congress Party had was lost because their government and government since, including Rajiv Gandhi and onwards, really became a much more center-based, Delhi-based, technocratic idea of government. And this is, is parcel of it in a decade or so later. But Congress lost its grassroots when it became a party that thought, well, we're going to take everything now into Delhi, rule from here with the authority of the emergency initially, but it became then a bunch of technocratic advisors around Indira Gandhi, and the very nature of Congress grassroots. Remember, somebody like Rajni Kothari had said that Congress was a metonym for India. What he called the Congress system, he said, was Indian politics. The Congress represented, its tentacles represented all regions and different peoples. Right? So the Congress was really a metonym for Indian politics, Congress politics. and he called it the Congress system. That's what got destroyed in the emergency. That's what Indira Gandhi, Sanjay Gandhi and all set out to completely change the nature of the Congress. In that period, those changes took place. And as a result, RSS were able to develop a great deal of the grassroots that had been slowly building, then became mobilized in a much, in a much greater momentum. And it was particularly mobilized because it was the whole upper caste domination in Hinduism was very keen to say that no, we are not a divided religion, we're not a divided society, and the real enemy, we are the unified Hindus, both all castes, and the real enemy is the Muslim. And this emerged only in the 80s. I don't think it. I mean, there may have been antecedents of Mahasabhite elements in the Congress, but Gandhi and Nehru dominated the Congress.
Okay, so let me rephrase it a bit, sir. So then, I mean, if I pose it this way, that if unself-conscious of living together was a major thesis for Nehru, I mean, how he could generalize it? I mean, given the kind of differentiation, inequality, caste inequality, gender inequality that was prevailing at that point of time in India. I mean, do you think that these all factors served as a weak link for this thesis, which ultimately led to the situation what we are in today?
No, I'm trying to say that things occurred in the 80s which were new. You see, I keep saying this in lectures I give. You have to distinguish between antecedents and roots. All these earlier things, no doubt Nehru had flaws, no doubt Gandhi had flaws, no doubt there were Mahasabhite elements in the 1920s onwards in the Congress. After all, people like Sampurnand and Tandon and all made it impossible to retain Urdu in the kind of pervasive instruction that it had. All sorts of things happened in the past. There were all sorts of unresolved issues that came from the existence of Mahasabhite element, the existence of a Savarkar ideology, and so on. But nobody can deny the domination of the inclusive nationalism over these other things. But I'm saying, so there were antecedents, there were unresolved issues, and so on in the past. But you've got to distinguish between antecedents and roots. When you say something is the root of Narendra Modi was the Mahasabhite element in the Congress, then you have to show an organic causal path that traces the root to the flower that you have of present Hindutva. Nobody's shown that. Nobody's shown how this causal trajectory exactly happened. But I'm giving you a causal trajectory of how the Jansangh, which was relatively, had very little representation in parliament, became the tremendously much more powerful representation parliament of the BJP through from the late 80s onwards. I'm telling you, that's how it emerged, through things like this. Nobody has shown the causal roots, how the causal roots flowered through a detailed trajectory from the past. You can't just say, because it was there, it's the roots of this. That's no way to do history. So you've got to distinguish between antecedents and roots. Something can be an antecedent, but not a root. Listen, I have another interview to which I must go now, so I can't really stay for longer. I've got an interview at 11, and I must sit down and.
Yes. We are done with the Q&A session here. We have a last vote of thanks that our convener Sanjeev Kumar sir will forward to you, and we'll end today's event. And Sanjeev sir, please take the proceedings forward.
Professor Bilgramy, thank you for such an insightful presentation, and in fact it has triggered our mind, and there is a lot of provocations also that is quite visible in terms of the arguments and the question that has flowed. So we hope to continue this discussion in near future also, sir. I thank you for coming to this college and sparing your valuable time, and we look forward to have your engagement, particularly I think on the whole idea of enlightenment, the way we have been able to study and we were able to conceptualize. I think Gandhi makes a sense to us. So maybe what went wrong in India post-independence and the contemporary authoritarian tendencies that have come to prevail upon the Indian society and the psychology of that, I think that has some antecedent to the period of enlightenment. I think in your lectures and in your works you have reflected on that. Perhaps I think the audience will be richer if we can also relate Gandhi and the entire enlightenment and how this whole the perspective of what we know as knowledge developed. I think that's very important because these are all conceptual categories and perhaps we get confused when such a discussion happens, and therefore such questions also in a way provokes us in a very different way, the way you spoke about it, in a way problematizing the whole idea of India, what went wrong. So we are very thankful on behalf of Gandhi Study Circle that you became a part of us, and we hope that you will continue to be with us in the near future. So thank you so much, sir. And we also would like to thank our principal, Dr. Masroor Ahmed Bey, who has been always kind in supporting all initiatives that we had in the future, in the past, and we hope that he will be there with us in the future also. Many distinguished scholars, colleagues, and guests have joined this event from different parts of the world and abroad. We thank you all for joining us today. We are truly benefited from the rich discussion that followed through the lecture. And for that, I thank all the participants and particularly the students. I think they have been richer by this experience. Much of the pain in organizing this initiative has been taken by our dedicated team of volunteers of Gandhi Study Circle. They constitute our important pillars. I cannot name all of them because of the positive time, but in our pursuance, Dr. Savana and Dr. Tripta, they find valuable guidance and support. The success of this event will motivate us to carry such initiatives in future with your cooperation and support. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next series of lecture that we plan to have in the early November. So very soon we will have the second series of this series of the lecture. And Professor Bilgramy, we thank from the bottom of our heart. And of course, I think this engagement will continue in future. And if you have time, we can come out with some other ideas and concepts that you have been engaging with. So Professor Bilgramy and all of the audience present here, I thank you on behalf of Gandhi Study Circle. Look forward to you in the next event. Thank you all. Good night and good afternoon. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
So, everyone, you have any expression regarding this?
I think it's over, and I think we may also leave now. Sanjeev sir has
Yeah,
left already.
I think I
Huh?
agree. We can congratulate ourselves finally, and we can all leave now.
Finally, yeah. Yeah,
It
it
was